Hi, so I'm going to talk about nested loops now. Now, what are nested loops? Nested loops are basically the idea of having a loop within a loop. Alright, a loop within a loop. Alright, so just like how when we talk about if else, we can have nested if, correct? So an if else block within another if else block. Alright, so a nested loop means a loop within a loop. Alright, so of course there are different ways of doing it depending on what you want to achieve. Now we're going to just introduce you to the concept. Alright, so let me write the code and then I will explain to you how it's working. Okay, for num1 in range 3, for num2 in range 6, 8, print num1 and num2. Alright, now to make it a bit more easier to understand what's happening, I'm going to add in a bit more text here. So I'm going to say outer loop num1 inner loop num2. Alright, so for a nested loop, what basically happens is, for each iteration of the outer loop, I must go through and complete all the iterations of the inner loop. Alright, when I finish all the iterations of the inner loop, then I go back to the outer loop. Alright, now let me run the code and I'll show you the outcome, and then I'll explain to you why we're having this outcome here. Alright, so we have outer loop and inner loop. Alright, now let me explain to you what is happening. Alright, so let me copy the code here. Alright, and then we will come here. Okay, so the first thing, let's look at it step by step. Alright, so we have num1 and num2. Okay, so we have num1 and we have num2. Alright, now the outer loop num1 is range 3. Range 3, it goes from 0, 1 and 2. Correct, as we say, it starts from 0. When you have a single number for range, I start from 0 and I go to 1 less than the number here. So in this case, it will be 0, 1 and 2. When I have two numbers as in the inner loop, then what happens, I go from 6, 7, okay, and I stop there because 1 less than the last number. Alright, now as I said just now, when you have a nested loop, for each iteration of the outer loop, I must finish all the iterations of the inner loop, then I go back. Okay, so let's start off step by step. So the very first time, num1 is 0. Okay, and I come into the inner loop. So when I come into the inner loop, what happens? I must finish all the iterations of the inner loop, which means I must do 6 and I must do 7. Alright, so the very first time that I run the inner loop, I will do one printout, okay, of 6 and the second printout of 7. Okay, so what does this translate to? That means the very first time that I run the inner loop, I will say outer loop is 0 and inner loop is 6. Alright, so you have to remember that the outer loop has 3 iterations, inner loop has 2 iterations. For the outer loop, the iterations are for num1 value of 0, 1 and 2. Inner loop iterations, the num2 value is 6 and 7. Correct, so the second time that I run the inner loop, I will say outer loop 0 and inner loop as 7. Now, have I finished the iterations of the inner loop? Yes, correct, because once I finish 2 rounds of the inner loop, I have completed all the inner loop iterations. Then I go back and start the next iteration. So the next iteration of num1, I will go to 1. And when I come in to num2, again I have to go 6 and 7. So again 6, and 7. And what does that mean? Again the same thing. I have to say outer loop 1, inner loop 6. Okay, outer loop 2 and inner loop 7. Alright, so again I finished 2 iterations of the inner loop, which means I go back again, and this time round my inner loop, so my outer loop value for num1 is 2. Alright, so it will be 2, alright, followed by 6 and 7. So that translates to, okay, outer loop, okay, sorry, here is supposed to be 1, because that is still outer loop of 1. Now outer loop here is 2, alright, inner loop is 6, okay, outer loop is 2 and inner loop is 7. Okay, so now I finish both iterations of the inner loop. When I go back, alright, I won't go back anymore, sorry, because I've already finished, alright, all the iterations of the inner loop. Okay, so once I finish all the iterations of the inner loop, which means I have finished, I finished all the iterations of the outer loop, so I will no longer continue with the inner loop as well. Alright, so always remember, you start off with the outer loop. For each iteration of the outer loop, you complete all the iterations of the inner loop. Okay, so for 0, outer loop, inner loop must go 6 and 7. Then go back. Outer loop 1, inner loop 6 and 7. Then outer loop 2, inner loop 6 and 7. And that's it. Okay, so you won't have any more outer loops to complete, which means you have already completed this entire nested for loop. Okay, so yes, the first time you look at it may be a bit confusing, but once you try out the code and you see it for yourself, you'll be able to understand what is happening. Alright, so let's just change some numbers to understand. Alright, so if I change this to, let's say, 4, so the same thing, outer loop goes from 0, 1, 2 and 3, but each time I go the outer loop, I must complete the inner loop. Now the inner loop range is 6 to 8, which means I start off with number 6 and 7 and that's it. Now let me just change this. If I increase this to 9, that means what happens? For each iteration of outer loop, the inner loop must go 6, 7, 8. Correct? Must go 6, 7, 8. Alright? So that's what you see here. 6, 7, 8, 6, 7, 8, 6, 7, 8 and so on. Alright? So you need to sort of play around. Alright? Play around with the numbers to have a better grasp of how this nested loop works. Okay, so again, let me repeat the most important concept: outer loop and inner loop. Outer loop, for each iteration of the outer loop, you need to complete all the iterations of the inner loop. Okay, so if the outer loop range is set to 4, which means I go 0, 1, 2, 3. For outer loop num1 0, I must complete all the iterations of the inner loop. So in this case, inner loop is going from 6 to 8, right? 6, 7, 8. So I finish all the iterations of the inner loop, then I go back to the next iteration of the outer loop and so on. So the process keeps repeating itself again and again until I have completed all iterations of the outer loop. Once all iterations of the outer loop are complete, that means in this case I go 0, 1, 2 and 3, then I have completed everything. So I can, okay, just for clarity, I can just put one statement here to say print end of program. Okay, so you can see that once I finish everything, I say print end of program. Okay, so I hope you get a better idea how this nested loop concept works. Alright, again, you must try it out. You must put in different numbers and see for yourself how changing the range for outer loop and inner loop affects the printout. Okay, so thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next video. Bye.